Good afternoon. I'm Stephen Schneider. I'm Director of Grace Parish, and it's my great pleasure to welcome you this afternoon to this special lecture, which is part of our Centennial celebration. We're delighted to have each of you here, distinguished guests, ecumenical partners and colleagues, friends and neighbors, members of the Grace community. Centennial celebrations are oftentimes to look back across the years to the period of beginnings and to all that has transpired across the years. But a centennial can also be a time to look forward to that world which is now coming to earth, and to ask the question, what are the challenges and opportunities now before us as people of faith? This brings us to today and to this unique opportunity we have together to consider the question, what does it mean to be a church for the 21st century? And there is surely no better person we can find to help us reflect on this vital question than the 26th Presiding Bishop of the Episcopal Church. A commentator recently observed that global is the new local. Due to proliferating technologies, we have the capacity to span great distances with instant ease. This is a daunting and yet exciting time to be alive. It is also, I believe, a time when those of us in the church are called to engage our world with imagination, passion, and courage. We're immensely honored today to have with us someone who embodies that creative engagement, a rare individual, someone who is a religious leader on the world stage, who also knows how to speak with an Oregon accent. Bishop Katharine Jefferts Schori.
Thank you. I don't think Oregonians have an accent. It's a great joy and delight to be here, and we're going to be fairly informal here today. I'm going to talk for a bit, and then I really do want to invite some conversation. We will learn more, I think, than just having me talk at you. Maybe I'll just preface this by saying a little bit about that word. Conversation is a word that comes into English from Latin about the year 1300. And if you look at the roots, it literally means to turn about with. And conversation in early English meant to live with, or to spend time with, or we would say today, to hang out with. It didn't mean to talk. It meant to spend time. All right, who are we as an Episcopal Church, and what are we becoming? What does it mean to be a church in the 21st century? This tradition that I represent is legally and officially known as the Domestic and Foreign Missionary Society. That's been our name since the early 1800s. We are an international and multicultural church, even though some people still want to call us ECUSA, the Episcopal Church in the United States of America. That's only part of who we are. We have 10 overseas dioceses. We're also in the church in Micronesia, and the convocation of now Episcopal churches in Europe represents 6 countries in Europe. We are in ecumenical relationships of significant strength and others of growing strength. We're full communion partners with the Evangelical Lutheran Church in America. We're in something called interim Eucharistic sharing with the United Methodist Church. We hope on the road to being in full communion. We're going to vote this summer at General Convention on a full communion agreement with the Moravian Church. If we say yes, the Moravians are going to vote on it next year, and we could then be in full communion with yet another branch of Christianity. We're going to vote on a resolution at General Convention this summer that invites us into a deeper relationship with the Presbyterian Church. It won't be a full communion agreement, but it will be a commitment to work together in mission. We're a church that is known for at least the beginnings of multi-faith dialogues. congregation are buying land together to build common facilities. Each will have its own worship space. They will share meeting space, green space, and a parking lot. And if you think about it, the Muslims worship on Friday, the Jews worship on Saturday, the Christians worship on Sunday, and God willing, the buildings will be used by the community the rest of the week. It's a model of what is possible. Each of those communities faith communities has committed not to try to convert each other, but to learn more about their own faith in dialogue with those of another tradition. I think that is a piece of what it means to be church in the 21st century. We are now a church focused on mission and missionaries in this increasingly global and multicultural context. Domestic mission in this church is increasingly focused on the least among us. At General Convention this summer, we will also consider a resolution inviting us to focus intentionally on poverty in the United States in a coherent way that I hope begins to look like the way in which we've looked at poverty in the developing nations through the MDGs, the Millennium Development Goals, in an accountable way, in a way that has benchmarks and expectations for movement. And the hope is that we might begin by doing that with Native American communities, which are among the poorest in this country. There are places of poverty in the United States on Native American reservations, in the Mississippi Delta, in the inner city, that look as bad as some of the places in the developing world. But the MDGs are about developing nations, not about supposedly developed ones. Domestic mission right now looks like a focus on communications and evangelism, teaching about Christ as we know Christ, in language and images and metaphors and music that new generations understand. And that's not always Elizabethan English. We're also increasingly focused on our growing domestic populations. The kind of people who fill most pews in the Episcopal Church, and looking around here, I don't think this is an exception, but increasingly gray-haired and white Episcopalians are not replacing themselves. Episcopalians don't produce children at the rates they did in the 1950s and the 1960s. We can no longer depend on evangelism by reproduction. Episcopalians are beginning to learn how to tell their faith story in a way that invites people into relationship in the same way that they're willing to tell about their latest restaurant discovery. Few of us are afraid to tell people about that. The hope is that we will become increasingly comfortable and excited about sharing the good news that we know in communities like this. We're increasingly focused on new congregations and forms of faith communities, what's sometimes called emergent church. I'll tell you an example of one. It is not an Episcopal church, but it has lots of interest in and attraction to the Episcopal church. A place called Solomon's Porch in Minneapolis. It meets in a former Methodist sanctuary that's a little bigger than this one, maybe twice the size of this space. It's filled with old couches, not pews. And they're not arranged like this. They're arranged in little conversation pits. And in the middle of the space is a step about like this, one step up, that has 2 bar stools on it. The people who speak sit on the bar stools, and they speak for a little while, and then there are conversations among the 250 or 300 people who are gathered sitting on the couches and floors, and babies on the carpet and the blankets, to be Christian community together. It would drive some Episcopalians absolutely bonkers. But Christian community is being built in that place in a way that addresses the needs of spiritually hungry people. If we're going to be serious about evangelism and sharing the good news we know, we're going to have to get out of our comfortable pews. We're also beginning to see congregations thriving in untraditional kinds of places. I was in Boston a couple of months ago, and after the main services in the morning, at noontime, the Chinese student ministry met. The service was conducted in Mandarin. Simultaneous translation with headsets was provided in Cantonese and in English. The leader of the congregation is a layman. A priest from the larger Episcopal Church community comes in to provide sacramental service, but the leadership has come from the community. At the very same time, on the steps of the cathedral, was going on a worship service serving the homeless people of Boston. And the table, like this, that was set up at the top of the stairs, was used to serve Eucharist and then to serve a fuller meal. And there were people standing around when we walked out to greet them, eating. That's part of our church of the 21st century as well. And if you think about it, that is what the church in the first century looked like. We're going back to our roots. That is what radical means. Let's talk for a minute about international mission. As Stephen mentioned, we are a church that's increasingly focused on the Millennium Development Goals, not just because they're a good idea, but because they give us an image of what it looks like to move toward the reign of God. If we achieve the Millennium Development Goals, the kingdom will not have arrived in its fullness, but we will have gone a long way toward it. And we will understand what it would look like to continue the journey. International mission also looks like continuing to develop relationships with other parts of the globe where we sent missionaries in decades and centuries past. Places like Brazil and Mexico, and the Church in Central America, and the Church in the Philippines, and the Church in Liberia, that were missionized by Episcopal missionaries that are now their own parts of the Anglican Communion, and with whom we still have a covenant relationship. And it's not the covenant that we're talking about so much right now. They are covenants that were built by people from the church in Brazil and people from the Episcopal Church to talk about how we would continue in relationship with each other, what the expectations are of each, and how we will support financially, and how they will support us in our ability to better serve the people among whom we live and work and worship. International mission around the Anglican Communion is thriving. There are more relationships between congregations and dioceses around the communion than there were 10 years ago. And I think they are stronger relationships. They're not just a matter of people here sending money. Money is important, but we're putting flesh behind it. And inviting flesh from the other parts of the communion to come and experience us. We're developing a more deeply incarnate relationship. I know that Grace has many connections around the globe and desires to have more. When I first joined a congregation in Oregon, I think Oregon had a partnership relationship with the diocese in Mexico. I don't know if the diocese now has a partnership relationship or a companion relationship with another part of the community. Those are important ways for a whole group of Episcopalians to be in relationship, but congregational relationships are at least as important. They don't necessarily have to build the formal structure that's required to build a companion relationship. They simply greet someone they know as friend and say, how can we come and learn from you and how can we be of assistance? They need to be mutual. We need to not just be sending what we think the other people need. It needs to be a process of discovery, to discover what it is we can learn from people who live and work and worship in a very different environment. The work of Episcopal Relief and Development is an intrinsic part of how we serve the larger communion, how we serve the larger world. ERD works with development work in developing nations, and in this country, it does primarily disaster relief. The work after Katrina is a good example. One of the things that I think is increasingly true around this church is that we are understanding the interconnectedness, not just of human beings, but the impact of how we live has an impact on how other people can live in other parts of the world. It's been a delight to see all the recycling bins in the hotels and in the churches and at the camp last night. Oregonians have often been a leader in that particular area of stewardship. How our global economic system functions or malfunctions is a result of the stewardship we exercise of the economic system here. And I can't think of a better example than what we've been going through for the last year. It's had major impacts in other parts of the world, not just in financial centers of the United States. And it has changed people's ability to feed themselves, to remain employed. Issues of fuel use. The increasing use of ethanol has meant that the price of corn or maize has risen to such an extent that many people in sub-Saharan Africa, for example, go hungry. I don't think most of us realize that. We're beginning to. Where are we going? If you take one of those prayer books out of the pew in front of you and look at the back in the catechism, it will tell you that the mission of the church is to reconcile the world to God and each other in Christ. It's actually not the church's mission, it's God's mission, in which the church participates with partners. That reconciling work is the work that we do in every sphere of life, or it can be the work we do in every sphere of life. How we ensure that the hungry are fed, and the thirsty watered, and the naked clothed, and the homeless housed, and the lonely befriended, and the grieving comforted. All of those things that Jesus talks about and the prophets talk about as what the reign of God looks like. It also means peacemaking. Peacemaking in the face of conflict. The reign of God is present in glimpses around us and among us and within us. And that's the church's task, to discover those instances and glimmers next season, and it's already well begun, I think is going to be focused on multiculturalism and on mission. And they're interconnected. The growing parts of our demographic as a church are the overseas dioceses. No single diocese in the U.S. Episcopal Church has grown in the last year, the last 5 years, and the last 10 years. Not one. Some of them have grown in 1 or 2 of those periods, but not all 3. But the church in Taiwan is growing. The church in Honduras is growing. The church in Haiti is growing. The church in Europe is growing. Which may surprise you because people think of Western Europe as secular. People are hungry, spiritually hungry in Western Europe as they are here. One of the reasons I think that the Episcopal Church is growing in Europe is because it's relatively new and small, and it has to be creative. It's not established. It has to be responsive to the hungers that are there, and not saying, well, we already know how to do this. As I said a little bit earlier, populations of other ethnic backgrounds and language traditions and cultures here in the United States are also a growing part of the demographic around us. In some places, the Episcopal Church is addressing that. Some of you may be aware of this. It was on the other side of the country, but a Roman Catholic priest joined the Episcopal Church last week. He's a Cuban. He had been a remarkable evangelist in his community, and he decided that, and it was not a rapid decision, he'd apparently been talking to the bishop in Southeast Florida for a couple of years. But he was received as an Episcopalian, as a layperson, a couple of weeks ago. That's an invitation that I think is increasingly attractive. Our task is to present the gospel in the clearest and most honest way we know how, and to keep on doing it. That's the challenge among places like the Northwest, that is reputed to be among the least churched parts of the United States. Doesn't look like it here today. But people are spiritually hungry here. That's why little communities develop at Starbucks. I think that's actually why Starbucks has been such a phenomenon. It provided a local community center, if you will. People went there every day before work to get their coffee or went at lunchtime, and they got to know people there. That's actually something that the church knows how to do. But we have to figure out how to do it out there in the community and not just wait for people to come inside our beautiful red doors. That's the evangelical challenge for Episcopalians who remember pews that were full because we were producing children. Now we have to do the hard work of going out there and befriending people. And it's not such hard work. It's a blessing. It's a blessing. Particular pieces of our future in the next years, we need to learn how to train leaders for an increasingly multicultural world and a world that's changing more rapidly all the time. I'm going to have to learn how to use Twitter and Facebook. We need to make basic resources available. I worshiped with a Hmong congregation in Minneapolis a couple of weeks ago. They are translating the prayer book into Hmong. Cool. Piece by piece. And that's a lot of work. It's a big book. We need appropriate theological educational material official members of this church from all language and cultural backgrounds and ages. We need a greater willingness to experiment liturgically. And I see you've done a good bit here already. The prayer book that some of us still call new actually sounds pretty dated to many people today. Even many people the age of some in this room. It went a long, long way to addressing issues of language, particularly about human beings. It hardly started to recover the breadth and depth of our language about God. That's what some of the enriching our worship texts have done. We need to keep on doing that work. It needs to be done in every age. That's the challenge of Christians, and actually of every faith tradition, to present the good news, to present the good word of the Scripture in language and images that can be appropriated by people in a different culture. Because 2009 is a different culture from 1979. Music, image, metaphor that speaks to people today. We have to keep wrestling with that. That is how people internalize their faith. We also, I'm convinced, need to understand or recover the classical Anglican understanding of a variety of theological viewpoints as essential to our health. When we all think the same way, we begin to die. There needs to be room in this church for people who disagree with me and with you. And they need to know that. And they need to know that they are welcome and celebrated and equal members, even if they drive you crazy. Because the very energy that prompts that response in you or me is a piece of God's invitation, God's creativity, asking us to wrestle with something very important. Okay, let's talk a little more about mission. Mission, somebody has said that the church exists by mission as fire exists by burning. The church exists by mission as fire exists by burning. That is who we are. The Anglican Communion about 15 years ago identified 5 marks of mission. They said that mission is about sharing the good news that we know in Jesus. It is about teaching and nurturing and baptizing new believers. It is about addressing human suffering. It is about transforming injustice in society. And it is about caring for the earth. Caring for the earth. You know, if we wrote the baptismal covenant today, we would certainly get that last one in there. It is a creature of its time. It was a little too early. There is an invitation in each of those to the whole church to wrestle with what isn't yet the reign of God and what needs to be transformed toward the reign of God. It's a way of summarizing the realms in which mission takes place. And the Canadian Church challenged the Anglican Consultative Council a few weeks ago in Jamaica to think about adding reconciliation as conflict transformation as the 6th mark of mission. That's still under conversation. Essential piece. The church is moving, I think, toward a deeper understanding of stewardship. You probably hear some echoes in this. Stewardship, not just about what you do with what's in your pocket, but but stewardship is how you use the gifts that God has blessed you with, the skills you have, the time you have. I think Americans are misers about time because we feel so rushed most of the time. We overschedule our children. They never have any free time. They're always spending it on something that their parents decide is important. The great radical development of Judaism was Sabbath. The Puritans destroyed it. At least as we inherited that work ethic tradition, we've lost the ability to spend time in the presence of God and not doing something. I think that's a piece of our countercultural message to the larger society. Stewarding our time. We live in a society that's deeply hungry for the transcendent values of our faith. And when we can figure out how to present those in a way that people recognize or that touch the hungers around us, I think we will discover that we have rich and vibrant communities that are thriving. Some of them will grow numerically. Some of them won't. That's okay. Our job is to be present as incarnate and fleshed images of God in the communities in which we live and to work for their transformation. In the ballot box, at Starbucks, at the gas station, in our workplaces, in our schools, and in our churches. Now, I want to invite you to wrestle, push back, ask questions, have a conversation, spend some